Welcome. This is the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinscoe, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, Forbes contributor, and general explorer of the service and experience space. The thing I'm really interested in is how do we create organizations that produce better outcomes for both their customers and their people. This podcast has been running since January 2011, and so we have a big archive to explore. Check out the archive at adrianswinscoe.com. That's enough from me. Let's get into the interview. So, welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today is nobody, because actually today is different. Because there's going to be no interview today. Why? Because today I'm celebrating the 500th, 500, that is, 500th edition of the podcast. I mean, I should be going, whoop, whoop, way. Champagne corks should be going off, all that sort of great. I mean, it's pretty incredible to think about it in terms of how I've been able to achieve 500 podcasts. Anyway, I thought long and hard about how to commemorate the occasion and how I might be able to use an interview format to do so. And I did toy with the idea of having someone interview me, but then didn't get myself organized enough to arrange that. So you're going to get me doing something new, a monologue, if you like, where I share a few thoughts about my podcasting journey so far and what I've kind of like learned on the way. But before I move on that word monologue, when I say that word, I can't help but think about Octavia Spencer's character, Poppy Parnell, in a series called Truth Be Told, which is a drama about a podcaster who investigates true crime cases. Now, if you haven't seen that series, it's on Apple TV, I believe, then you should definitely check it out. Now, I'm not aspiring to the heights of Poppy Parnell's monologues, but that's just what it makes me kind of think. Anyway, I digress. And getting back on track, what I wanted to do was to share a few thoughts about my podcasting journey to date. So first, I want to talk a little bit about where, why, and how I got started podcasting, what it's led to. Then I'd like to share some highlights and shout outs to a few of my amazing guests before finishing with a little bit about what I'm planning next and how you can maybe help me. So let's just start at the beginning. And so my podcasting journey started back in late 2010, I think it was, after I'd published my first book, which is Rare Business, which the longer title underneath the subtitle is How Building Better Relationships with Your Customers Can Deliver Sustainable Growth. Now, that was a self-published book that I did as a bit of an experiment. It's now out of print, but I mean, I learned a lot through the process. And particularly what I learned is that book was made better by a series of interviews that I conducted for the book and also featured in it. So that made me think of, like, following the publication of the book, I wondered if I could continue using interviews and doing interviews through my blogging and article like writing, and how I could do that. And that's when I heard about this thing called podcasting. Now, remember, this was late 2010, approaching 2011, and podcasting wasn't really a thing back then. I mean, not like it is now. I mean, the podcasting was around. Many people were doing it. Many people had been doing it for years, but it wasn't like now, not the thing that it is now. So I set about researching what it was and how to do it. And I guess in true punk fashion, with my tongue firmly in my cheek, I just figured it out. I figured out what I needed and got started. And in truth, my approach was a bit DIY back then. And, you know, to be fair, it still is, I guess. And the first episode, which was an interview, was published in January 2011, which is just over 13 years ago. Now, at this point, I should give a big shout out to Grant LeBoff of Sticky Marketing fame, who was my first ever guest on the podcast. Thanks, Grant. Big shout out to you. I should also point out that the podcast wasn't always called the Punk CX podcast. Initially, it was called the Rare Business Podcast after my business opco, if you like, and then also the title of my first book. However, I changed it on the publication of Punk CX in 2019. And so the 500 episodes represents a series of interviews that I've been doing continuously over the last sort of 13 years. Now, the primary focus of the podcast was always about finding clues and insights about how do we build organizations that produce better outcomes for their customers, the people, and the businesses involved. As such, I've always thought of the podcast as being a bit of a research tool to find, learn about, and shine a light on people, things, and ways that could help drive those better outcomes. Now, my writing on the blog at adriansmithschool.com and the introduction of my podcast got me noticed, after a little while, got me noticed by one of the editors across at Forbes. Now, big shout out to Tom Post, who's a former editor at Forbes, who is now retired, because he was the one that I got put in touch with by an agency. The agency reached out to me and then introduced me to Tom, and we had a conversation, and he invited me to become a contributor over there. That was over 10 years ago. And actually, I was about 140 podcast interviews in at that time. So it wasn't just I got started and I got noticed. It was I was doing it and had been doing it for a little while. Now, when that happened, I thought, wow, that's awesome. And so it continues. I've been writing on Forbes now for 11 years come this summer of 2024. And it's been a huge honor to be able to write for that platform and brand. And it's helped me hugely. So thank you to all the folks at Forbes for allowing me to do that. It's always great. And it's a real pleasure and continues to be an honor. But as for how I used to find and organize my interviews, back in the beginning of the podcast, I used to do everything. Finding folks' interviews, doing the research, setting up the interviews, recording, editing, writing up the highlights, publishing, and then the socialization of the podcast. And I still do most of all that now, but I get help with editing with the podcast. Big shout out to Elliot Roach, my editing and production wizard. Elliot, you are a lifesaver sometimes, and you do great work. Thank you for that. Thank you for all you do. And also, I am very fortunate to not have to look too far for interview opportunities, as many opportunities now come my way through my network, meeting folks at events, clients, and a whole bunch of PR and AR agencies. In terms of what I've also kind of changed to help with that whole production process, I use speech to text translation technology and a bit of generative AI technology for the creation of the highlights, but not too much. The reason being is that I still prefer to be quite hands-on and quite manual and to create my own highlights. Why? Well, I recognize that's very labor intensive and potentially not needed depending on your perspective. Personally, I don't care, because actually the manual editing of the highlights, I believe, for me, cements the learning I get from the podcast that I do. And so I believe it's still worth the time and effort. Because for me, it's about finding those stories and curating those stories and sharing those stories. It's also about the learning that goes on through that whole process. And to it, I often say that I do honestly believe that podcasting has made me smarter. But that takes up time, a lot of time actually. And I actually kind of counted up how much time I've spent doing the whole podcast thing over the last 13 years. And it amounts to somewhere in the region of 2,000 hours, which I worked out was probably the equivalent of about one working year. And when I did that calculation, that number shocked me. 2,000 hours, the equivalent of one working year. I thought, wow, that's huge. That is quite a lot. But I think it's worth it. It's always been worth it for me. I really enjoy the podcasts. I really enjoy meeting the people. I really enjoy understanding a bit more about what they're doing and how they're doing and why they're doing it. So I think it's worth it. It's worth the effort. It's worth the investment of time. And I believe I get back so much more from doing it than it actually costs me in terms of time. But I do use a podcast platform to host my podcasts, and the one I use is podcast.co, which is a Manchester in England, that is, based outfit that I've been using for nearly 4 years now. Now, they're brilliant because they came along at just the right time, just after or at the point when the podcasting app that I was using, that was serving up all my podcasts on my website, it just stopped working. And not a crash, it just stopped working. And I was left with having to do a massive migration. And that we're talking about between 250 or 300 interviews that I had to migrate from AWS onto their kind of platform and then link them all to the existing podcast pages on my website for all 250, 300 interviews. That took me an absolute age. But it was worth it, and their platform's great. It provides me with a mini podcast site, which is, you can find the link to it on the website. It provides me with editing, publishing, and automatic distribution options to all the major podcast platforms like Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon Music, Acast, etc. Which is great. But as for face-to-face interviews, I now have, again, I've sort of improved my setup, and I have a Shure directional mic that I use or connect to my phone or my laptop, depending on what I want to use to record. But I've also started using some very, very cool wireless lavalier mics from Hollyland that I've just got hold of, and I've just had a chance to use them for the first time when I went to the Adobe Summit a few weeks ago. And so I ended up doing conducting a couple of interviews there, and they were very cool, very, very kind of a very nice bit of kit. So anyway, I get quite nerdy on some of this sort of stuff because I really enjoy figuring out how to put it all together. But now that we've covered the technical, in inverted commas, story of the podcast, I thought I'd scroll through the archives with you a little bit and highlight a few interviews of people that have stood out for me across the last 500 interviews. So here's some shout outs and episodes to look out for if you feel inclined to dive into the archives. And the first interview I wanted to highlight was one that I did with Michael O'Leary of Ryanair. And that was episode 144, I believe, back in May of 2015. And that came about, the short story version of it is I wrote a piece on Forbes that the headline was, "Does Michael O'Leary really care about his customers?" or something of that order. And fascinatingly enough, Michael wrote me a letter. I got it arrived by email, but it was like a PDF copy of a letter that his assistant sent to me and said, "Yes, I do. And here's why." And he explained his position. And I just thought it was supremely funny. So I actually replied and said, "Thank you for that. That's great. Can I talk to you about that on my podcast?" Not expecting to get any reply. And he said, "Sure, let's do that." And so that was and we had a great conversation where he told some great stories about getting drunk with Herb Kelleher of Southwest Airlines and a whole bunch of other kind of things, which was great. So if you haven't heard that one, then you do check it out. Then there was the times that I interviewed Seth Godin, and I've spoken to Seth twice now on the podcast. That was back in 2012, in December 2012, and also then again in November 2018. And both times were awesome. And now some people say that you should never meet your heroes, but I can just say that Seth was brilliant and was very generous with his time, and I loved talking to him, and I salute and appreciate all the work that he does. And then talking about kind of heroes, and I think legends, I have been lucky enough that over the last few years I've been able to interview Tom Peters, and I've been able to speak to Tom 3 times on the podcast. That was in April 2018, July 2020, and then lastly on March 2021. Now, Tom is now retired in large part, but I think I consider him a legend, a hero, and it's always a pleasure to talk to. He's always insightful, very generous. But I do believe that his books, his ideas, and his point of view live on and still resonate rather. And I'm honored to have been able to record just a mere fraction of some of his insights along the way. Another person I wanted to kind of mention that I've spoken to, I'm honored to be able to call him a friend now, is Paul Greenberg. I spoke to Paul back in August 2019, and he's often referred to as the godfather of CRM. And I just want to say thank you to Paul for his support and just for being great and very, very insightful. And it's no wonder he's often referred to as the godfather of CRM. And I'm really happy to be able to call Paul a friend. And so big hugs, Paul. Big shout out. And I look forward to speaking to you soon. Next, people I want to give a shout out to are all the winners, including 4 women of the My Customer Experience Leader of the Year Awards. Sandra De Zoiza, who I spoke to back in December 2019, who's the Group Chief Customer Officer at Dialogue Axiata in Sri Lanka, and she won the Leader of the Year competition back in 2019. I was introduced to her by Paul Greenberg as he features Sandra in his book, The Commonwealth of Self-Interest. She was also a contributing artist for Punk XL, so big shout out to Sandra. Then there was James Scott when he was at the post office, who won it in 2020. James is now at Qualtrics. Then there was Sri Safitri, who is the Deputy Executive VP for Customer Experience and Digitization at Telecom Indonesia. She won it in 2021. Then there was Manisha Busal, who was the Director of Customer Experience and Marketplace Operations at Jingdong Indonesia, JDID, which is a subsidiary of Jingdong, JD.com, one of the largest retailers in China, and she won it in 2022. And then latterly there was Roxy Strom-Menger, who is the GSO VP CX Strategy at UKG, and she won it in 2023. Now, all of that I was helped with along the way by Claire Muscat, and I must give a massive shout out to Claire for, one, being my interview partner for many of the interviews for the CX Leader of the Year award winners for the last few years, but also for starting the fantastic Women in CX community. And the work they do over there is absolutely tremendous. And so big shout out to Claire. Ooh, moving on. God, there's so many. Next person who I loved talking to was Rory Sutherland. I spoke to Rory twice, once in 2015, once in 2019. Rory is just fun, and the number of insights that he shares into behavioral science, and he tells so many brilliant stories. But also, I got a proof copy of his book, and the thing I really loved about it, it's on the spine of the book. It's all colored gold. It all looks quite fancy, but it's all colored gold. But on the spine, it's got written on the spine of it, "Benign bullshit," which I thought was just brilliant. It's not the title of the book, and I'm not sure if it's on the actual book, but it's at least on the proof copy that I received. So I just thought it was a brilliant kind of like piece. Then next up, I wanted to mention a few people at Pega who I've spoken to, a number of people over there over the years. Particularly, I want to mention Alan Treffler, Don Sherman, and Rob Walker, and also everybody else I've spoken to from Pega, because one, they're just, I think what they do is very cool, but also that just for leading the way about what is possible with tech in the customer service and customer experience space, but doing it in a safe and ethical way. So bravo and chapeau to you, gentlemen and ladies, and all at Pega. I also want to say huge hello to my fellow podcaster, Minter Dial, for his support and for accompanying me along the way. He has his own podcast and has now clocked up more than 560 episodes, so I think that's about right. So great job, Minter, and keep going. I think you do great work. Then a couple other kind of like things I wanted to just share, just for particular people from companies that have been doing some cool things. I mean, I want to start with, like, say, Pauline Wilson in 2018 I spoke to her when she was the COO at Virgin Holidays, for sharing her story about going undercover as a COO with our marketing director, and then being able to see things from a customer's perspective and experience things from a customer perspective, and how that led to them developing the departure lounge that features in Virgin Holidays now, and also the importance of endings. Wanted to say incredible thanks to Martin Gribnow, who I spoke to in 2018 as well, when he was at Genworth Financial, and he told me a story about his approach to focusing his time on taking on a new transformation project. I mean, I think how he carves up his time to allow him to see how an organization really works, how he stays connected to the front line and when people actually can deal with customer problems in real time, and how he kind of then manages all these other objectives and obligations is truly inspiring, and shows what can be done when we dare to play our own game and to back ourselves in bigger organizations. I want to say massive shout out to all my Punk XL artists and collaborators: Ari, Amy, Laura, Richard, Serena, Joyce, Paul, Martin, Karen, Sandra T, Sandra DeZ, and Claire, who contributed a wonderful set of tracks for Punk XL, as well as Tom and Matt, who laid things out for us and helped the whole production process and colored things in, and Ocean, who checked the spelling. I remember the podcast that we did where we had 2 different podcasts where we tried to bring everybody together and just talk about the book and the process and everything. I love that whole process. They're brilliant and part of my extended podcast family. So thank you to all of them. But then there's also I wanted to talk about Lord Mark Price, who I spoke to, who's the former managing director of Waitrose and the deputy chairman of the John Lewis Partnership. I spoke to him twice in 2018 and 2019, but just for giving me an inside look at how John Lewis and Waitrose here in the UK, who are kind of an iconic brand in that service and experience space, for giving me an inside look of how they produce such great service and experience and what happens when you treat your people well and look after them. And linked to that, and sort of extending that, I had a chance to speak to Ray Biggs in 2023, actually, who was the former head of customer care at John Lewis and Waitrose, and he's now at Ventrica, who gave me the inside track on their customer care program and how they focus on agent and partner well-being, particularly in the face of turnover, attrition, and burnout and changing working arrangements, and how they've implemented well-being timeouts and how we talked about the changing nature of management, leadership, especially in that customer care environment. So there's some really, really brilliant insights into how to do it well and what it looks like when you do it at a big brand level. But also a big shout out to kind of like Ray for, and this is probably just as important as anything else, for the fact that he's also a fellow Kickers wearer. Now, if you don't know what Kickers are, then just look up Kickers boots or Kickers shoes, and you'll see what I mean. Particularly the blue ones, which I know that is some of probably Ray's favorite colors. So big shout out to Ray on that. Next up, I want to say I want to mention Liz Graham, who I spoke to in 2017, and she was the vice president of sales and service at Wayfair, and for actually telling me a story about how they changed their thinking about how they recruit people, and actually for showing us that some of the best talent can be found where passion exists in abundance, and how they changed their recruiting practice and went to look for talent, passionate talent at Comic-Con, and how that helped them find people just that were naturally passionate about things, and how they could use and transfer that passion into kind of a service environment. Brilliant story, brilliant approach. I don't hear it often replicated. And but it's the insight there is I think is brilliant. I want to say thank you to John Timpson, who I spoke to in 2016. He was leading the whole Timpson organization here in the UK. But when I went to visit them in their head office, I thought it was brilliant. That they have a director of smiles at the front desk of their head office. And I just want to say thank you for John for telling us his story, sharing his time with us, but for keeping things simple and for trusting people and being willing to give them a second chance, and for all his ideas around upside down management and what happens when you do that. And I'm super, super happy to see that his son James is picking up where his dad has left off, and I see him starting to kind of bang that drum kind of more and more in the public eye. And so that's brilliant. They're a great company, and they can really look after their kind of people. Next up, and I promise you we're getting towards the end of it. And in terms of my shout outs. Next up, I want to just mention Delphine Mousseau, who I spoke to in 2016, when she was the VP of Markets at Zalando, the fashion retailer, online retailer, who help me, describe to me how they deliver great service across 15 different countries across Europe, and how it's the little things that can be the difference between being average or being great. And one of the very, very simple insights that she shared was that through their work, most of their service ops were based in Berlin, and they were serving people across Europe. But they realized, actually, through some of their insights work, they realized that the Swiss, despite the fact they're on the same time zone as Germany, they realized that the Swiss generally, and this is a big generalization, obviously, but generally speaking, they believed, or they found out, that the Swiss get up about an hour earlier than the Germans do. And so they thought, well, if they do that, we're going to open up our Swiss service desk an hour earlier than we would normally open up the Germans' service desk in order to better serve the Swiss market. They did that. Swiss loved them for it because it gave them, it worked more to their kind of like their timetable, and ratings and everything else just kind of went up. So that was, really interesting kind of insight over and above. I mean, on top of a whole bunch of other ones. The next one I wanted to mention was Henry Stewart, who I spoke to in 2011 for just starting and growing a company called Happy. I mean, what a fantastic name. And talking to me about why creating a great place to work is probably the best investment decision that you'd ever can make. And then but also talking to me about how they treat people, even when they have to fire them for gross misconduct. I mean, Henry told me a story about one time when this happened to them. And rather than just sort of fire the person and shun them and be done with them, they actually helped the person get a new job. And for me, I think that's like taking employee experience and responsibility and care for a person, and care for a person's well-being, to like a whole new level. And I think it's wonderful, and it sets an example for us to follow and aspire to, but also makes us ask kind of questions about what we do with employees and when they come to the end of their time with us, in particularly kind of like when that time is not actually kind of great, and do we still have a responsibility to them or not? Henry thinks that we do, and if we do that, then it comes back in bucket loads in terms of what you get back to that. Next thing, another one from 2011, as I was kind of, this stood out for me when I was going through the archives, was when I spoke to Mark Mullen not long after he took over as CEO at First Direct, which is a bank in the UK, an online telephone bank in the UK, which is renowned for its customer-centric approach to its business, and has won numerous awards and accolades, and has a heap of admirers, and has been setting high standards for the last 35 years or so. And the one thing that Mark told me, which I think still stands to this day, and he said this. He says, as a business, you have to understand the limits of customer interest in your business. And I think that's just a really brilliant thing to say in terms of to make us stop and think about the role that we play in a customer's life, and where the reality is that we're not as important as we might like to think we are. And we need to kind of take that into account in terms of what we do and how we do it in order to better serve our customers. Now, next up, Mikkel Svenem in 2012. He was the chief executive and founder of Zendesk. I mean, we had a great chat at the early days of Zendesk journey. I mean, look at where they are now. I mean, Mikkel is no longer with them. He has moved away from the business, and they've got new kind of leadership. But the things he was telling me still resonate today. I mean, one great insight he shared was that I think it still needs to land for many. He said to me, it doesn't make sense that when firms say that they're customer service or customer focused, that their call center agents or their contact center agents or those on the front line delivering an experience are some of the lowest paid employees in a business. Now, that was back in 2012. And 12 years on, and after a cost of living crisis, that is more true than ever. And it has to change. The next shout out I want to give to Carrie Smith and Dave Waltz in 2014, and they were both big ass fans. One, big shout out to them for having the best brand name ever. Big ass fans, I think, is the best name for a company ever. But also for sharing their find and fix customer problems approach and their story about how they did that, and how it was central to growing the Big Ass Fans business fivefold over a course of like 6 years. I believe that business grew from like $35 million to $175 million in revenue in about 6 years. Now that story, they told me that story was 10 years ago, and I still tell that story. And people are still impressed by it. But I've heard of very, very few firms or people willing to replicate that sort of approach or make that sort of commitment in service of making things better for the customers. I really believe the opportunity is still there. Too often do we fall to mass digital methods for trying to capture insights. But I think the opportunity is still there, particularly for B2B firms that want to make things better for the customers, to drive business growth and differentiate themselves from their crowd, is to take what Kerry and Dave were talking about 10 years ago and to implement in their business and watch magic happen. I want to do also a quick shout out to Joe Coulson. I've spoken to a couple of times over the year, 2012 and 2020, who's the CEO of the Institute of Customer Service here in the UK. Joe, just a shout out for the effort, the advocacy, the research, and the general work that you and your team do. I mean, kudos to you all. This is getting quite a long list now, but I think I need to keep going. And hopefully you're sticking with me and you've got some bookmarks that will help you and encourage you maybe to dive into the archives, because there's a lot of decent stuff in there. I mean, and this is what I mean. When I had to review it, I was thinking, blimey, all of these things, all of these people, this is brilliant. So I'll just keep going, shall I? Well, you're not going to reply to me right now, and so I'll just keep going. This is a broadcast. And I'll give you a chance to respond at the end. So I want to say, 2020, I spoke to Professor Stefan Tomke, who's a Harvard professor, for his chat about his book, Experimentation Works, and how experimentation is the thing that's made Google, Microsoft, Netflix, and Booking.com so successful. He told me all about kind of what they do and how they do it, and some stories about some of the impacts of adopting an experimentation culture, and the benefits thereof. I think it's crucial, definitely something I would actually check out. And for another story about that explains the sort of the reality of situations sometimes. I mean, I remember speaking to Nick Mehta in 2020, who is the CEO of Gainsight, this customer success platform. So I want to say thanks to Nick for his advocacy for customer success, but also for explaining why it's an increasingly important area for organizations, but also for telling me a story that exposes the gap between rhetoric and action, particularly in this customer-focused, customer experience sort of space. Because he told me a story about a friend of his who's a CEO of a roughly 1,000-person software company. So not a small affair. And he told me a story about what happened when the pandemic hit and we were forced into lockdown. And about a couple of months in, he was speaking to this friend, and this friend told him, he says, here's the thing. He said to Nick, he said, you know what? We're finally doing the things that we always should have done. He said, we've never understood our customers better. We've never had a better connection with them. The thing that fascinates me about that is that it took a pandemic to wake some folks up about this and about the importance of looking after your customers. I mean, sheesh, blimey. But it shows you that actually it's not just about talk, right? It's also about doing stuff. And what I think I've tried to do on the podcast is to try and find people that share stories about what they're doing and how they're doing, and the better outcomes it can drive, or they're driving, but also maybe that people that are producing things that can help drive those outcomes and convert that rhetoric into action. Like, for example, I remember speaking to Matt Dixon in 2022, and he's the Wall Street Journal bestselling author of some could argue some of the most important business books of the last few years. I mean, The Challenger Sale, The Effortless Experience, and The Challenger Customer. And I spoke to Nick about his latest book, which is The Jolt Effect, in 2022, and which I think is a fascinating and AI-enabled research effort into customer indecision and what great salespeople do to help customers. It's also on sales, which I think is an often forgotten part of customer experience, but an important part as well. But it's also some of the insights in the interview and some of the insights in the book apply not just to customers and their indecision, but just indecision generally. And some of those things I think can be used when we're thinking about if we're customer experience leaders or professionals, and you have to try and influence people in order to get them to help you, and also to support kind of like projects that you want to do or things that you want to kind of change. There's some really kind of crucial kind of like, insights into how you can help people make decisions or break them free from the bonds of indecision. And then, bear with me, only a few left to go. I want to say big shout out to Josh Feast at Cogito, who I spoke to in 2017, and then also in November 2022, and also celebrate Josh and the team at Cogito for doing something different. I mean, along with Sandy Pentland at MIT, and also how they leverage his social physics theory and book. And I want to celebrate them for being ahead of the market in terms of real-time agent assistance. I mean, and by building a technology that drives really impressive outcomes. Now, I've spoken to a few other people at different companies over the years that, despite having a great idea and a great technological solution, they were a little bit in front of where the market was at, and have not been able to stay the course, so they've had to pivot to something else in order to survive. But actually, in large part, Josh and the folks at Cogito haven't done that. So kudos to them, and for staying the course, because as it's showing now, the market has come to you. So nice one. Next, I want to say, go back to an older one. Back in 2012, I spoke to a guy called Rob Brown when he was systems thinking director at Aviva. And he told me about how they'd use systems thinking to improve customer satisfaction and employee engagement. I mean, what they did was they completely organized their work and the way they did it to better meet customer needs. I mean, it sounds radical, but it's not actually. And it makes an eminent amount of sense when you really think about things from a customer-centric perspective. If you haven't listened to this interview, I would really encourage you to dig into the archives, as with all of these interviews I've highlighted, and do check these out, as well as others, because I think it's really fascinating. And every company should be thinking about doing things in this way, yet they're not. And because they're not, you have to ask why. And because sometimes it feels like we make things hard for ourselves, or there's a bunch of other things that get in the way. I mean, I met Rob at a systems thinking event hosted by Professor John Seddon and Vanguard Consulting, and was lucky enough to interview John Seddon twice, in 2013 and 2020. And both times the interviews were fun and enlightening. But John characterized some of the bigger one of the biggest things that organizations often get wrong, and generally goes a long way to explaining why things often go wrong in service organizations, when he said, is that organizations often take a typology of customer demand and then try and fit it into how they want to do business. Now, if you think about that explains a lot, right? It explains why there's often a mismatch between what customers want and what they get. And we say we're being customer-centric, but when you think about that, we're not really. Something to think about. And finally, I want to mention both of the interviews that I conducted with Professor Gareth Jones in 2016 about workplace culture, and also Jack Springman in 2022 on the many problems that the current approach to CX has, and also for highlighting that CX professionals need to, and CX leaders need to not forget that they also have internal customers too, and they need to pay attention to them, not just external customers. I mean, both were great guests, did great work, shared some wonderful insights, and were widely respected. But sadly, since the podcast interviews, both of them have passed away. And I'd just like to say they're both missed, and may they rest in peace. And finally, and I promise it's a finally sort of bit, here's an apology to all of the guests I haven't mentioned. I mean, at 500 episodes, there are just too many of you to acknowledge. But I want to give a big shout out to every one of them for gracing me with their time and gracing the podcast with their time, their insights, and their stories. I mean, just thank you. But also thank you to the listeners. I mean, I hope you're still here. I hope you're still with me. Kind of this is in my monologue, he says in inverted commas. I hope you enjoy listening to the podcast and get as much out of it as I do in making them. I mean, just to wrap up, here's a quick list of some of the things that I've learned over the last 13 years. First of all, if you don't ask, then you don't get. That's the thing the big thing that I've learned about this is, like, when I started is, like, you get to speak to some amazing people if you just ask. And because here's the thing, people are often more than willing to share their own stories. But when you actually do get a chance to speak to them, then try and make it fun, but also as easy as possible for your guests. And also, don't be afraid to interrupt or ask a question or have an opinion. As more often than not, guests want to and enjoy having a proper conversation, like a proper rummage around and all of that, because it makes for a more enjoyable time. It's not just them being a blowhard. It's just like, liking the sound of their own voice. No, most people are really interested in some of this stuff and appreciate somebody else being really interested in what they're doing and how they're doing it. The other thing that I've learned is that technology changes fast, and it often comes and goes. But people and organizations, on the other hand, they don't change that fast. And that's often where some of the biggest barriers to delivering great service or a great experience lie. And actually, we should spend just as much time thinking about how we change ourselves and our organizations as we do thinking about technology. I don't think we necessarily get that balance right. The next thing I just wanted to say, the last thing I want to say in terms of one of the lessons, I'm sure there's probably more, but this is the ones that popped up to me when I was kind of thinking about doing this, is that serial podcasting takes time, effort, and commitment. But for me, the commitment has been so worth it. So much so that, and I think I said this earlier, I truly believe that podcasting has made me smarter. So that's all for me. And I guess that's enough for now, I think. Now, as for what comes next, I mean, quite frankly, I think it'll be more of the same, I think. Now, I'm sure I'll make some changes to the format and the regular questions I ask along the way. But if you have any questions or suggestions or comments, then please let me know. And that includes if you have any suggestions for guests too. Even if you don't know these people, but just say, "Ooh, I think it'd be cool if you spoke to that person." Or if you spoke to that person, then I can figure out if I can try and put a request in to see if I can make that happen. So please join me as I wander around the service and experience space, looking for clues about how we can deliver those better customer, employee, and business outcomes. I mean, thank you for the last 500. And here's to the next 500. Ooh, actually, that makes me want to break into the Proclaimer song, "I'm going to be 500 miles. But I won't, thankfully. That's enough for now. See you next time. Thank you. Find out more about me and the work that I do at adrianswinsco.com. Do leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any comments, feedback, or questions about the podcast, then feel free to send me a message to podcast@adrianswinscoe.com. Do tune in again. Thanks very much.